Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you're watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture.
So now that we have finished our examination of syllogisms, we will turn to study two more forms of deductive reasoning, which we call molecular arguments. We're going to look at the conditional form and the disjunctive form of deductive reasoning. So these are two more deductive forms of reasoning, which means they're governed by rules of inference, and we determine their validity based on their form, that is, based on the structure of the relationship between the premises in the argument. Conditional arguments we can recognize because they're signaled by the if-then logical operator. And by logical operator, we mean simply a word or a phrase that indicates not only that reasoning is underway, but which actually helps to structure the form of the argument. It indicates which set of rules of inference are relevant and applicable to that particular argument. So conditional arguments are signaled by the if-then logical operator or variations of that, and we'll see a number of variations in natural language. And then disjunctive arguments are signaled by the either-or logical operator, or variations of the either-or expression. And again, you'll see variations of that in natural language arguments. So both of these forms are called molecular arguments, and that's because they begin with a molecular statement as the first premise. A molecular statement has two essential parts. Now, to be sure, we're not talking about two statements. We're talking about one statement with two parts. So think about a molecule in chemistry. You have, for example, the water molecule, which is H2O. That tells us there are two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen for every molecule of water. But we don't get water without those two essential parts. And that's the reason we use this metaphor, if you will, to describe this type of argument, because it begins with a molecular statement, and the molecular statement has two essential parts. So then we take the molecular statement, which always functions as the first premise in a molecular argument. We take that molecular statement and combine it with another premise that leads us to a logically necessary conclusion. And again, like other forms of deductive reasoning, if these arguments are structured according to the rules of inference, they will lead to a logically necessary, that is, a certain conclusion. So as we said, conditional arguments use the logical operator if-then, and disjunctive arguments use the logical operator either-or. These logical operators tell us how the form of the argument must be structured. That is, how the reasoning must progress according to the rules of inference in order for us to reach a logically necessary conclusion. And it is these formal properties that allow us to determine the validity of the argument, just as it was with syllogisms. So we look at how the parts of the argument relate to one another, and we can determine whether that structure follows rules of inference or not, and if it does, the argument will be valid. So just like syllogisms, conditionals and disjunctives also have rules of inference. So let's start with conditional statements. Conditional arguments begin with a molecular statement, and in conditional arguments, those are conditional statements. The molecular statement is structured in a conditional by the if-then logical operator. And so we say that statement has two parts. The first part is the antecedent, which is the if clause of the molecular statement. And the then clause is called the consequent. That is what happens if the antecedent is true. And so these are the two molecular parts of a conditional statement, which is the first premise of a conditional argument. Here's an example. If you understand this explanation, then we will move to the next slide. So you see in this statement, and note that it is just one statement, it's set up by the conditional logical operator if-then, and it has two parts. It has the if clause, which is if you understand this explanation, and it has the then clause, which we call the consequent, which is then we will move to the next slide. So we have the antecedent and the consequent, which are the parts of the conditional statement, a molecular statement, and that serves as the first premise of a conditional argument. So what does a conditional statement say? It advances a conditional truth. It doesn't assert or affirm that something is true, but it gives us the condition under which something could be true or might be true. So we can know for certain that the consequent will follow only if the antecedent is true. That is, the antecedent sets up the condition under which the consequent would be true. So the two things are related, and the truth of the consequent is dependent on the truth of the antecedent. So if the antecedent is true, then the consequent will follow. That's what a conditional statement says. So we also have to be careful that we don't overinterpret or overanalyze or read too much into a conditional statement, because with each conditional statement, there are things that we do not know, right? The conditional statement alone does not tell us whether the antecedent is true. It only tells us if the antecedent is true, the consequent will follow. And neither does the conditional statement tell us whether the consequent is true. It only says the consequent will be true if the antecedent is true, right? So we don't know for certain whether the antecedent is true or whether the consequent is true. So if I say, if the Red Sox sweep the Yankees, then the Red Sox will be in first place. But if we just look at that statement, which is a conditional statement, and we see there the logical operator if-then, we see the antecedent, the Red Sox sweep the Yankees, we see the consequent, the Red Sox will be in first place, right? But we do not know whether the Red Sox beat the Yankees. Neither do we know whether the Red Sox are in fact in first place. So did the Red Sox sweep the Yankees? The conditional statement itself doesn't tell us that. Are the Red Sox in first place? Again, the conditional statement by itself doesn't tell us that. It only gives us the conditions under which we could conclude with certainty that the Red Sox are in first place. So what that tells us is that we need more information. And in a conditional argument as a deductive form, that more information comes in the form of a second premise. So conditional arguments require a second premise that relates to that first premise or the conditional statement. So we need additional information, and we get that in the second premise. The second premise tells us something about the first premise. The second premise will either affirm or deny the antecedent or the consequent. So this gives us 4 possible options, 2 of which are valid and 2 of which are invalid forms. For a valid conditional argument, the second premise must either affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent. Only with these forms can we reach logically necessary conclusions. So if you look at the overall argument, you'll see the second premise, and you want to ask, what does the second premise do in relation to the first premise? Does that second premise refer to the antecedent, or does it refer to the consequent? And then we want to know, does it affirm or deny the antecedent, or does it affirm or deny the consequent? A conditional argument is valid only when the second premise affirms the antecedent or when it denies the consequent. Those are the only forms that allow us to reach a logically necessary conclusion. The other forms commit fallacies of conditional arguments. In an invalid conditional argument, that is one that does not permit us to reach a logically certain or necessary conclusion, the second premise will either affirm the consequent or deny the antecedent. These might seem like natural language arguments that make sense, but logically speaking, they are invalid. They do not follow rules of inference. And so when you see a conditional form where the second premise affirms the consequent or denies the antecedent, you have an invalid argument, an argument that does not follow rules of inference. So here's an example of a valid conditional argument. We'll start with the conditional statement, the molecular statement, which is the first premise of the conditional argument. If the beer is cold, then we will go fishing. Now you notice here, we don't have any certain truth that the beer is cold. We don't have any certain truth that we will go fishing. We only have the condition under which we will go fishing. So if the beer is cold, that's the antecedent, then we will go fishing. That's the consequent. So we need more information. We need a second premise. The second premise tells us the beer is cold. Now we look at this second premise and we want to see how it relates to the first premise. And this is the key for understanding the analysis of conditional arguments. You are always interested in the relationship of the second premise to the first premise. The conclusion is important and you'll need to find the conclusion, but once you find the conclusion, set it aside and forget about it, because the testing of the argument, the testing of the validity of the argument, depends on your understanding how the second premise relates to the first premise. And in this case, we look at the second premise and we see, first of all, that it refers to the antecedent. And then second of all, we note it affirms the antecedent. So in the molecular statement, the conditional statement, the antecedent is if the beer is cold, and the consequent is then we will go fishing. And then the second premise tells us the antecedent is true. That is, the beer is cold. And that allows us to conclude with certainty that we will, in fact, then go fishing. Right? Therefore, we will go fishing. So when we say this is a valid argument, we say it's valid because the second premise affirms the antecedent. That's one of the valid forms of a conditional deductive argument. Here's another example. If he passes the summer argumentation course, then he will graduate with his class. So again, the if-then logical operator, which tells us this is a conditional statement. We have the antecedent, he passes the summer argumentation class, and we have the consequent, he will graduate with his class. But we don't know yet whether he has passed the class. We don't know whether he has graduated. We need that more information. So we look for the second premise, and then we look at how that second premise relates to the conditional statement. Here's the second premise. He did not graduate with his class. Now we notice this refers to the consequent of the conditional statement, and we note that it denies the consequent. So if we know then he did not graduate with his class, we know for certain then that he also did not pass the summer argumentation course. Therefore, he did not pass the summer argumentation course. We can conclude that with certainty. This is a valid conditional argument. Why? Because the second premise denies the consequent, and that's one of the valid forms of a conditional argument. But then you also have the possibility of two fallacies related to conditional arguments. Because, as we said, the second premise might refer to either the antecedent or the consequent, and it might either affirm or deny the antecedent or the consequent. And that gives us four possible relationships or four possible structures of that conditional argument. And so what happens if we use one of those forms that violates a rule of inference? Here's an example. If the importer collects the duties, then the government will not impound the foreign products. So there's the conditional statement, the if-then logical operator. The antecedent is the importer collects the duties. The consequent is the government will not impound the foreign products. The second premise says the importer has not collected the duties. So again, we note that this second premise refers to the antecedent, but in this case, that second premise denies the antecedent. It tells us, in other words, the antecedent is not true, or the condition which was set up under which the consequent would be true, that condition has not been met. So the second premise here denies the antecedent. What does that allow us to conclude? Well, it allows us to conclude nothing with logical certainty, because the statement, the conditional statement, doesn't tell us what happens if the importer does not collect the duties. It only tells us what happens if the importer collects the duties. And so because we don't know what happens when he has not collected the duties, in that case, we cannot draw any certain conclusion about whether the consequent has followed or not. So you might be inclined or instinctively want to conclude the government will impound the foreign products, but in fact, we don't know that for certain, because again, the conditional statement doesn't tell us what happens under the condition where the duties are not collected. It only tells us what happens when the duties are collected. So we cannot draw this conclusion with certainty, and that makes the argument invalid. It violates that rule of inference that says conditional arguments are valid when the second premise affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent. In this case, the second premise denies the antecedent, and so it commits the fallacy of denying the antecedent. And then we have the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So we start with the conditional statement. If the musician plays an encore, then the fans will buy more t-shirts. So in this case, we have the if-then logical operator. We know it's a conditional statement. We have the antecedent, the musician plays an encore, and the consequent, the fans will buy more t-shirts. Then we get the second premise that tells us fans bought more t-shirts. Does that mean necessarily that the musician played an encore? Well, it might instinctively tell us that that's what's happening. However, based strictly on the rules of inference or the formal properties of the conditional argument, we cannot draw the conclusion that the musician played an encore. Why? Because it tells us if the musician plays an encore, fans will buy more t-shirts. But it doesn't tell us that that's the only reason fans buy more t-shirts. They could be buying more t-shirts for lots of different reasons. It only tells us if he plays an encore, then they will buy t-shirts, but they could be buying t-shirts for lots of other reasons as well. Therefore, the musician played an encore is not a certain or logically necessary conclusion. It is an invalid form because in this case, the second premise affirms the consequent. It says the consequent has come about, but we don't know that the consequent has come about simply because the antecedent was true. So in this case, we commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So now we'll move to discuss the rules of inference for disjunctive statements and disjunctive arguments. Now, disjunctive arguments, we said, begin with the molecular statement using the either-or logical operator, or variations of that. But in standard logical form, it would be either-or. The molecular statement is the first premise of a disjunctive argument. Just as with a conditional argument, the molecular statement serves as the first premise. In this case, the molecular disjunctive statement is the first premise of a disjunctive argument. The statement, again, has two parts, and in disjunctive statements, we call those two parts the first and second disjunct. So a disjunctive logical operator, either or, means a particular thing. It's important to realize this. One of the disjuncts must be true. However, the way we interpret or reason about disjunctive statements is, even though one of them must be true, it's possible both might be true. In other words, of the two disjuncts, both cannot be false. So with an either-or statement, what we know is one of the disjuncts must be true. They could both be true. They cannot both be false. And that should tell you something about which of the forms of disjunctive arguments is valid and which is invalid. Because just like with conditionals, you need more information, and that more information is provided by the second premise. So here's an example. Either President Trump orders all U.S. citizens to wear masks in public, or the coronavirus pandemic will spread uncontrollably across the continent. So here we have a disjunctive statement. That disjunctive statement is signaled by the logical operator either or, and we have two disjuncts. The first disjunct is President Trump orders all U.S. citizens to wear masks in public, and the second disjunct is the coronavirus pandemic will spread uncontrollably across the continent. But how do we read this? How should we understand it from a logical point of view? From the perspective of deductive reasoning, we read this as either President Trump orders U.S. citizens to wear masks in public, or the coronavirus pandemic will spread uncontrollably across the continent, or both of these things will happen. In other words, we know one of the disjuncts must be true. They both could be true. And so knowing that one of them is true doesn't really tell us anything at all about the truth of the remaining disjunct. And that should tell you that the only valid form of a disjunctive argument is a form in which the second premise denies one of the disjuncts. In other words, if I know one of these statements is not true, I can conclude that the other one must be true. And that's a logically necessary conclusion, making it a valid argument. So what does that disjunctive statement say again? It claims that one of two things will be true, and we can know for certain that one of the choices is true only if we can know for certain that the other one is false. So if one disjunct is false, then we can conclude with logical necessity that the other one must be true, because either disjunct could be true, but knowing one is false remains that the other one has to be true. So if we know one disjunct is true, what do we know about the other? The answer is nothing for certain, and that makes a second premise, which affirms a disjunct, creates an invalid form of the disjunctive argument. So just as it was with conditional arguments, the key aspect of analyzing disjunctive statements and disjunctive arguments is to look at the relationship between the second premise and the molecular or disjunctive statement. You want to know, does the second premise refer to the first or second disjunct, and does it affirm or deny that disjunct, right? So disjunctive statements require a second premise that relates to that molecular or disjunctive statement. The second premise is going to tell us something about the first premise, and the second premise will either affirm or deny the first or the second disjunct. For a valid disjunctive argument, then, the second premise must deny one of the disjuncts. Only this form enables us to reason for certain that the remaining disjunct is true. On the other hand, an invalid disjunctive argument, that is, one that does not permit a logically necessary inference, in such a case, the second premise affirms a disjunct. It tells us that one of the disjuncts is true, but because they could both be true, we don't know whether the remaining one is true or false. And because we don't know, it's an invalid form of the argument. So when we have a second premise that affirms one of the disjuncts, the first or second disjunct, we say the argument is invalid because the form is the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. So here's a valid disjunctive argument. Either the dining hall improves the quality of the breakfast menu, or the students will discontinue the purchase of meal plans. So there's a single statement, a disjunctive statement, signaled by the either-or logical operator. We have the first disjunct, which says the dining hall improves the quality of the breakfast menu. And we have the second disjunct, students will discontinue the purchase of meal plans. Do we know whether the dining hall improves the quality of the breakfast menu? Do we know students discontinue the purchase of meal plans? We don't know yet. We need more information. In other words, we need a second premise. So here's the second premise. The students did not discontinue meal plan purchase. Okay? So in this second premise, we note the second premise refers to the second disjunct, right? The or clause of the statement. So students, the second disjunct says students will discontinue the purchase of meal plans. And then we learn in the second premise, the students did not discontinue meal plan purchase. So that second premise denies the second disjunct. And this allows us to conclude then that the dining hall improved the quality of the breakfast menu. Why? Because when we look at that first disjunctive statement, we know one of the disjuncts must be true. They could both be true, but they cannot both be false. Therefore, knowing that one of them is false, we conclude with certainty that the remaining one is true. And so we can conclude in this case that the dining hall improved the quality of the breakfast menu. So this is the valid disjunctive argument form, and in that valid form, the second premise denies one of the disjuncts. So if we say this, either the dining hall improves the quality of the breakfast menu or students will discontinue the purchase of meal plans, and then the second premise says the dining hall did not improve the quality of the breakfast menu, here we're denying the first disjunct. But again, this permits us to conclude with certainty then that students discontinue the purchase of meal plans. Why? Because one of the disjuncts must be true, and we learn in the second premise that one of them is false, and that allows us to conclude that the other one must be true. So, students discontinued the purchase of meal plans. But then there are forms where the argument commits the fallacy of affirming a disjunct, where the second premise tells us one of the disjuncts is true, but that doesn't allow us to conclude anything about the remaining disjunct. Either she will go to the beach with her friends, or she'll study for her argumentation quiz. She studied for the quiz. Do we know that she didn't go to the beach? Well, we don't know that for certain. Why? Because the first or disjunctive premise here says either she'll go to the beach with her friends or she'll study for the argumentation quiz. And we know that one of those must be true, but they could both be true. And so knowing that one of them is true, that she studied for the quiz, does not allow us to conclude with logical certainty that the other one is false, right? So she must not have gone to the beach. Again, it might be instinctive that we would draw that conclusion, but in fact, we cannot logically deduce that that is true with logical necessity. In other words, the second premise, because it affirms the disjunct, commits an invalid form of the argument. It's the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. So here's the first example. Should the situation arise that the COVID-19 pandemic remains pervasive and lethal, then UNH will hold only online classes in the spring semester. It seems, however, that we are likely to have an effective vaccine distributed before the spring semester begins, and that means the spread of the pandemic will cease. So, UNH will go back to face-to-face instruction starting in late January. So as you look at this argument, again, what I suggested is first, read it in natural language, try to determine where the conclusion is, right? So if you look down at the last sentence, you see that argument indicator so, and so tells you here's the claim of the argument. In other words, here's the conclusion of the deductive form. So knowing that's the conclusion, in this case, UNH will go back to face-to-face instruction starting in late January. We mark that, but then let's set that aside because that doesn't help us determine whether the argument is valid or not. What we're interested in is the relationship of the second premise to the molecular statement. So we don't have any obvious logical operators here, so we want to look for variations of logical operators, either if-then or either-or. And in this case, the first sentence begins with, should the situation arise, which is a variation of if, right? So should the situation arise that the COVID-19 pandemic remains pervasive and lethal, then, and so we do have a then there, a then clause, UNH will hold only online classes in the spring semester. So we should recognize that first statement or first sentence as a molecular statement, and it's in conditional form. We have the antecedent, the COVID-19 pandemic remains pervasive and lethal. And we have a consequent, UNH will hold only online classes in the spring semester. But note, we don't have enough information to know whether the antecedent is true or whether the consequent is true. We need additional information. So we need to look for a second premise. And so as we read on in the argument, it seems, however, that we're likely to have an effective vaccine distributed before the spring semester begins, and that means the spread of the pandemic will cease. So in this sentence, we actually have that second premise and evidence in support of the second premise. So the second premise can be found after the argument indicator that means, right? And the second premise is the spread of the pandemic will cease. And the evidence in support of that second premise is we're likely to have an effective vaccine distributed before the spring semester begins. So that's the evidence in support of the truth of the second premise. But the second premise itself is the spread of the pandemic will cease. Now, if you look at that second premise, and then you want to ask, how does that relate to the first premise? Does it refer to the antecedent or the consequent? That is, does it refer to the COVID-19 pandemic, or does it refer to UNH and online classes in the spring semester? It's clear that we're referencing the antecedent about the pandemic. And so we know it refers to the antecedent. And then the next question is, does it affirm or deny the antecedent? So the antecedent here is the COVID-19 pandemic remains pervasive and lethal. But the second premise tells us the pandemic will cease. So that's a denial of the antecedent. Now, that would be great news. However, we cannot conclude with certainty that UNH will go back to face-to-face instruction starting in late January, because the form of the argument is invalid. In this case, it commits the fallacy of denying the antecedent. The second premise tells us the antecedent is not true. We don't know what happens if the pandemic will cease. The molecular statement, the conditional statement, only tells us what happens if the pandemic continues, right? So we have an invalid conditional argument, and it commits the fallacy of denying the antecedent. So let's look at another example. The employer promised to lay off a third of the workforce unless the union agreed to pay cuts and benefits concessions. Because the layoffs did not occur, it is clear that the union agreed to the cuts and concessions. So here again, we have an argument in natural language, but we recognize that we have a conditional form. The conditional form is signaled in this case by the word unless. Unless we always read as if not, right? And so we have, in effect, a negative antecedent, and the conditional statement would be unless, that is, if the union does not agree to pay cuts and benefits concessions, then the employer promised to lay off a third of the workforce. Now you see there what I've had to do is restructure the parts of that first or conditional statement to put them in standard logical form or logical order, with the if clause or antecedent clause first, followed by the consequent. You won't always get everything in exact logical order when people argue in natural language, but you want to put the antecedent clause first and the consequent second. So again, we take that first sentence and we recognize within it a conditional statement, and the conditional statement would be translated as if the union does not agree to pay cuts and benefits concessions, then the employer promised to lay off a third of the workforce. Now, we go down to the next sentence. we start with the word because, which is an argument indicator, and that tells us we have evidence, or in other words, a premise, right? Because the layoffs did not occur, then it is clear that there's another argument indicator that tells us here comes the conclusion or the claim, right? It is clear that the union agreed to the cuts and concessions. So we've said that that second statement in the second sentence is the claim or conclusion. Let's note that, but put that aside for the moment, and then think about the relationship of the second premise, because the layoffs did not occur, to the conditional statement, which says if the union does not agree to pay cuts, then there will be a layoff of a third of the workforce, okay? So in this case, we have a second premise that says the layoffs did not occur. That refers obviously to the consequent of the conditional statement. And what does it do with in relation to that consequent? It denies the consequent. The consequent was there would be a layoff of the third of the workforce, but the second premise says the layoffs did not occur. So we have a second premise that denies the consequent, and that's a valid form. So we can conclude for certain then that the union did agree to pay cuts and benefits concessions. Here's another example. The professor gave the student two choices. On the one hand, he could complete the work by the deadline in the syllabus. Then again, he could delay submission of the assignment and take a grade penalty of 20%. The student was hit with the 20% grade penalty, so I guess he turned in the assignment late. So in this case, again, you're reading the whole argument in natural language. Try to find the conclusion. It's signaled here in the last sentence by the argument indicator so, and the conclusion is stated as I guess he turned in the assignment late, right? You'll also recognize that this is a disjunctive argument, signaled by the first sentence. The student had two choices. And again, we don't have either or, but we have on the one hand and then on the other, all right? So we have the two choices set out. Either the student completes the work by the deadline in the syllabus, or the student takes the 20% grade penalty, all right? So that's the disjunctive statement. And again, what do we know about a disjunctive statement? It tells us the first disjunct might be true, the second disjunct might be true, or both disjuncts might be true. So the valid form has to tell us one of those disjuncts is false in order for us to conclude that the other one is certainly true. In this case, however, the second premise is the student was hit with a 20% grade penalty. That affirms the second disjunct, and this is an invalid disjunctive argument because the second premise affirms the second disjunct. It might be the case that the student turned in the assignment late, but we don't actually know that because the disjunctive statement says he could turn it in on time, or he could get a 20% grade penalty, or both things could be true. So knowing that one of them is true does not allow us to conclude with certainty that the other one is true. So in this case, we have a disjunctive argument that is invalid because it commits the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. Here's another example. The class will end early if the students have no questions about the lecture. However, it looks like we'll have to stay because Cindy and Patrick are here, and they always have questions as they try to impress the professor. So in this case, we have, I think, obviously a conditional argument. We have that if clause in the first sentence. But notice again, we need to restructure that sentence so it's in standard logical form for a conditional molecular statement. So we would restructure it as, if the students have no questions, then the class will end early. All right, now look further down in the argument and see if you can find the conclusion. However, it looks like we'll have to stay because Cindy and Patrick are here, right? And they always ask questions. The because tells us what follows is evidence. In other words, a premise, which means the conclusion is what remains. It looks like we'll have to stay because, okay? So if the conclusion is it looks like we'll have to stay, we note that and set it aside. And now we are interested in what does that second premise, Cindy and Patrick are here and they always have questions as they try to impress the professor. What does that tell us in relation to the first or conditional statement? Go back to the conditional statement. If students have no questions about the lecture, then the class will end early. The second premise here refers to the antecedent, the if clause of the conditional statement. That antecedent was if the students have no questions, and here the second premise says Cindy and Patrick will always have questions. So that denies the antecedent. Notice that the antecedent is a negative and the second premise is affirmative, but that's opposite, so we call that the denial of the antecedent, okay? So in other words, it tells us the antecedent did not come true. So if the students have no questions, then the class will end early, but Cindy and Patrick are here and they always have questions. That's a denial of the antecedent. The conditional statement tells us what happens if there's no questions. It does not tell us what happens if there are questions. So we cannot conclude with certainty that the class will end early because this is an invalid form of the argument. The conditional argument is invalid because the second premise denies the antecedent. Here's another example. She could go to Mexico for spring break, or she could dedicate herself to completing her honors thesis. She doesn't have the money for an expensive Mexican vacation, so she won't be sipping tequila in Puerto Vallarta. Instead, I'm sure she'll be finishing her thesis. So here again, you probably recognize this as a disjunctive argument. She could go to Mexico for spring break, or she could dedicate herself to completing her honors thesis. There's the disjunctive statement, first and second disjunct. And then we can look down farther and we see instead, I'm sure she'll be finishing her thesis. That's the conclusion. So let's set that aside. And then let's concentrate on that second sentence, which is she doesn't have the money for an expensive Mexican vacation. That's evidence, and it's evidence to support the claim of the second premise. So the second premise here indicated by the argument indicator so, right? She won't be sipping tequila in Puerto Vallarta, right? How do we know that's true? Because she doesn't have the money for an expensive Mexican vacation. So now that we know that second premise is true, we can ask, what does that second premise do in relation to the disjunctive statement? The disjunctive statement gives us the two options or disjuncts. She goes to Mexico or she finishes her honors thesis. The second premise now tells us she won't be sipping tequila. In other words, she does not go to Mexico for spring break. So the second premise denies the first disjunct. It's therefore valid and reasonable to conclude with certainty that she will be finishing her thesis. So this is a valid disjunctive argument because the second premise denies the first disjunct of the molecular disjunctive statement. So here's one more example. On the condition that the judge determines that the parking attendant was negligent, the car owner's insurance company will not have to pay for repairing the vehicle. Based on my analysis of precedents, I am convinced the judge will find the attendant to have been negligent. It follows that the insurance company is off the hook for the cost of repairs. So this is a pretty straightforward argument, even though it's in natural language. The form of the argument is pretty clear, and it should be pretty obvious that it is also a conditional argument. Indeed, the first sentence begins with "on the condition that," which sets up the antecedent. So we then want to work to find the conclusion, and we see down in the bottom sentence, right? It follows that, and there's a good argument indicator that here comes the conclusion. It follows that the insurance company is off the hook for the cost of repairs. So let's set that conclusion aside and then concentrate on the relationship of the second premise to the conditional statement. So the conditional statement is, again, on the condition that, or in other words, if the judge determines that the parking attendant was negligent, then the car owner's insurance company will not have to pay for repairing the vehicle. So that's the whole conditional statement, which functions as the first premise. The second sentence says, based on my analysis of precedents, I am convinced. So that's the evidence in support of the second premise. But what's the second premise? The judge will find the attendant to have been negligent. Okay? So notice here, the conditional statement, the antecedent is the judge determines the parking attendant was negligent. The second premise says the judge will find the attendant to have been negligent. That affirms the antecedent. That means this is a valid conditional argument because the second premise is affirming the antecedent. It therefore enables us to conclude with certainty that the consequent will follow. Remember, we know the consequent will follow, or the consequent will be true if indeed the antecedent is true. And here the second premise tells us the antecedent is true. It follows necessarily then that the consequent is also true. In other words, it follows that the insurance company will not have to pay for the cost of repairs. A valid conditional argument. So one last example. The university soccer team will win the national title if they can recruit that striker from Brazil or get a waiver for the British exchange student to play midfielder. The NCAA has ruled the British midfielder to be ineligible because of his earlier play for a club team at Oxford. However, the Brazilian has signed with the team, so it looks like we'll be celebrating a championship. So in this argument, you probably recognize that it is a conditional because there's a clear if clause or antecedent if they can recruit that striker from Brazil or get a waiver for the British exchange student to play midfielder. But what do you notice about that antecedent? It's complex. That is, it has two parts to it, and it tells us in effect that either of these antecedents could be true, and then that would produce the consequent. So it doesn't say they both have to happen. It says if one or the other happens, the consequent would follow. So we would restructure that first sentence in standard logical form as if they recruit the striker from Brazil or the British exchange student plays midfielder, then the university soccer team will win the national title. So we have that sort of complex antecedent, two possibilities of an antecedent, either of which would produce the consequent. Then we get further information. The NCAA has ruled the British midfielder to be ineligible, so we know that antecedent did not happen because of his earlier play for a club team at Oxford. However, the Brazilian has signed with the team, so we know the other antecedent has in fact occurred. And we go back to that if clause that says if they can recruit the striker from Brazil or get a waiver for the British exchange student, right? So either of those antecedents is enough to produce the consequent. Be great if they had them both, but all we need to know is that one or the other has occurred, and then we can conclude that the consequent would follow. So that's where we get to the last sentence. However, the Brazilian has signed with the team, and that's the key second premise. We do get the Brazilian striker, right? So, signaling the conclusion, it looks like we'll be celebrating a championship. So to reframe the whole argument, we have if they recruit the... So to reframe the whole argument, if they can recruit the striker from Brazil or get a waiver for the British exchange student, then the team will win the national championship. They get the striker from Brazil, so we'll be celebrating a championship. That second premise affirms the antecedent, or it affirms one of the options for the antecedent, and that allows us to conclude with certainty that the consequent will follow. So that's an introduction to molecular arguments, both conditionals and disjunctives. Again, if you want to review this material, all of it is covered in that document on formal logic. And I would encourage you to review both the examples there and the discussion and instructions on how to test the validity of those arguments. But if you have any questions on this presentation, on either molecular or disjunctive forms or their fallacies, please post those to the discussion board. Now, as we go forward, you'll have 2 more homework assignments. Homework exercise 19 is all conditionals for you to test, and homework exercise 20 is all disjunctive arguments for you to test. On the final quiz, you will have a section on the quiz on molecular arguments, and that section of the quiz will be like these examples in this lecture or slide presentation, because you'll have to determine first what type of argument you're dealing with, conditional or disjunctive, and then apply the appropriate rules of inference for that form to determine if it's valid or invalid. And if it's invalid, to pick the appropriate fallacy. So again, if you have questions on any of this, post them to the discussion board.